Hey guys, tonight we dive fork first into the soggy, sour, and slightly moldy world of medieval food. Imagine you're waking up on a damp straw mattress, rats scratching in the rafters, and the only thing waiting for you in the kitchen is yesterday's bread, if you're lucky. If you're not, it's crawling with flour beetles, hard as a roof tile, and covered in something that might be mold or cheese. Hard to say. You're about to spend an entire day living as a regular medieval peasant. No royal feasts, no gleaming banquets, just the harsh, crusty truth about what people really ate. Spoiler alert, it sucks. It's either rotten, bug infested, or weirdly dangerous. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching this from somewhere particularly medieval sounding, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you all are tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge barefoot to the wooden table, rubbing sleep from your eyes. The room smells like smoke and turnip peels. Breakfast is on the table, a crust of yesterday's bread. It's dark, grainy, and dense, like it's been forged more than baked. You tap it against the table. Yep, still solid. Bread is your lifeline, your daily staple, and possibly your cause of death. In medieval Europe, especially in poor villages, bread isn't made with refined flour. It's mixed with whatever's on hand. Rye, barley, oats, and sometimes, in lean times, sawdust or dried bean powder. And it's not the fluffy kind you might picture. Forget white, crusty loaves with a golden shine. This bread is a squat brown puck. You chew, and it crumbles like packed dirt. There's a crunch, but not from the crust. Tiny bugs. Flour weevils. By now you don't even notice them. Flour goes bad fast when there's no refrigeration, no sealed containers, and your mill is open to the elements. Weevils, moth larvae, mites, they just come with the territory. You sift them out if you can, but they're small, and sometimes you're too hungry to bother. Your bread tastes a bit sour. That's the fermentation. Natural, unintended sourdough. On a good day, it's edible. On a bad day, it's moldy. Green and white patches bloom on the edges, and you scrape them off with a knife, pretending that solves the problem. It doesn't. But you eat it anyway. There's a bit of history in every bite. Bread was so central to medieval diets that bakers could be arrested for cheating customers. In England, the assize of bread regulated its price and weight to protect buyers from fraud. Still, that didn't stop people from stretching dough with chalk, dirt, or spoiled grain. Sometimes, it wasn't even real bread. There was a gritty, makeshift version called horse bread, made from legumes, bran, and the sweepings from the mill floor. Originally meant for livestock, it became a poor man's loaf in hard times. You munch slowly, wondering whether the faint fuzz on the crust is just your imagination. But you're not alone. Everyone around you is doing the same thing. Even nobles, with access to better ovens and finer flour, couldn't always escape spoilage. The damp, drafty castles were breeding grounds for rot and mold. Here's a fun tidbit. Some medieval cooks tried to rescue stale bread by soaking it in wine or broth and rebaking it into something edible. Bread puddings and meat pies weren't just delicacies, they were survival tactics. And here's where it gets a little twisted. Historians still argue whether ergot poisoning from moldy rye contributed to mass hysteria events like accusations of witchcraft or dancing plagues. Ergot is a nasty fungus that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. All from your daily loaf. One moment you're eating bread, the next, you're convinced your neighbor's a demon and your hands are snakes. By mid morning, your belly is full of stale crumbs, your teeth ache from the grind, and there's still flour under your nails. You're already hungry again, but lunch is hours away, and it might be worse. Still, you tuck the last piece of crust into your belt pouch. Waste nothing. Tomorrow's bread might be even worse. You finish gnawing the last crust of yesterday's bug-riddled bread and reach for a drink. You're parched. Naturally, your first instinct is to look for water. But in the Middle Ages, that's a gamble you might not survive. There's a wooden bucket in the corner, half full of cloudy liquid. It smells faintly of pond. You peer in. A few dead gnats float on top. There's a thin film that glistens when you swirl it. But you already know this is better than what's outside. Streams and wells in your village are more cesspools than water sources. The latrines, those shallow pits everyone shares, often sit disturbingly close to wells. So instead, you reach for the safe choice, ale. It's weak, barely alcoholic, and brewed right here in your cottage. Your mother makes it in a cracked clay pot with barley, a handful of herbs, and wild yeast. It's sour, flat, and warm, but it won't kill you. Probably. Children drink it too, small ale they call it. Just enough alcohol to keep the bacteria at bay, not enough to make you slur your prayers. Water might carry dysentery, typhoid, or cholera. Ale carries a mild buzz and some yeast burps. You'll take it. Still, the brew's no picnic. Some batches taste like old socks. You've seen what goes into them. If there's not enough grain, people get creative. Crusts of bread, leftover porridge, boiled weeds. And let's not even talk about what stirs in the pot when it's left too long, but you drink it anyway. Because the alternative? That's where the real horror begins. You once tried collecting rainwater in a wooden bowl. It looked clean, sparkling even. Then your stomach turned into a medieval percussion instrument. A week of sweating, groaning, and praying to saints you barely remembered. You lost 10 pounds and nearly lost your life. Historians still argue whether medieval towns made serious efforts to separate waste from drinking water. Some cities, like London, eventually developed rudimentary aqueduct systems, wooden pipes, and even water carriers. But not for you. Not here. You carry your water in a pigskin bladder that leaks when it's warm. And when the village well runs dry in the summer, you boil swamp water and hope it doesn't glow. For nobles, it's a little better. Castles sometimes had deep wells and spring-fed cisterns, but even then, water often traveled through lead pipes. Yep, lead. So the rich might escape disease, but trade it for brain damage. A fair medieval bargain. In monasteries, monks tried to purify their water with charcoal filters and even early distillation, but those were elite experiments. Most people just avoided water altogether. Beer, ale, wine, anything but plain water. Even your morning porridge is boiled in small ale. A quirky bit of food history? Some medieval people believed water could unbalance your bodily humors. Cold and moist, it was thought to dampen your inner fire and lead to sluggishness or illness. Better to drink something warmer and fermented, even if it smells like old hay. You glance at the family dog, lapping puddle water from outside. Brave soul. Or just dumb. And while you're sipping your gritty mug of lukewarm ale, remember this. Flavor was optional. The drink might be bitter, sour, or oddly sweet if the brewer overdid the herbs, but complaining gets you nowhere. You once made the mistake of saying something tasted like feet. Your father shrugged and said, maybe it was. You burp quietly. The yeast bubbles back. Breakfast of champions. The worst part? You're still thirsty. Ale doesn't quite quench it. And since there's no refrigeration, you can't enjoy anything truly cold. No chilled cider. No ice. The idea of a glass of fresh, clean water from the fridge would be a fantasy tale. Right up there with dragons and reliable landlords. You take another swig, wipe your mouth with your sleeve, and set the mug down. Your tongue still feels dry. You'll try your luck with the well later. Maybe. Your stomach groans mid-morning, reminding you that bread and beer aren't exactly a balanced diet. But you already know what's next. Or more accurately, you hope what's next isn't spoiled. Because today might be a meat day. And in the Middle Ages, that's a culinary dice roll with maggots on the side. You head outside and follow the smell. Sharp, smoky, and just a little off. Hanging in the smokehouse behind your cottage is a hunk of meat that's been there. Well, a while. It's dark. Almost black in spots, with a crust that crackles when you tap it. That's not seasoning. That's age. Possibly mold. This is how your family preserves meat. Salt it, hang it, smoke it, and pray. No ice, no freezer. Just time and hope. The piece is hard as stone and slightly furry at the edges. You scrape it clean with a dull knife. If anything wiggles, you don't look. When you cut into it, the inside's a sickly gray pink. It smells faintly metallic. Probably fine. Your nose is your only food safety tool. That and the family dog's reaction. If he won't eat it, you definitely shouldn't. Today, he's licking the ground beneath your table. Encouraging. Meat is rare. Not because people didn't want it, but because it was expensive, perishable, and often reserved for the upper crust. You only get it when a pig is slaughtered, a rabbit is caught, or something dies in the woods. And even then, you share it with your entire extended family, and maybe half the village. So, this piece? It's been stretched thin. First boiled, then roasted, then reboiled into broth. It's more symbolic than satisfying. And yet, the noble tables overflow. The lords, they're devouring venison, roast swan, and whole boars on a spit. Their kitchens are lined with servants, spices, and silver platters. Yours, just a smokehouse full of hope and a table made of worms and splinters. Historians still argue whether medieval people could genuinely tell when meat had gone bad, or if they just got used to it. Some records suggest they tried to disguise spoiled meat with sauces or aggressive spices. A pinch of cinnamon, some vinegar, a splash of sour wine. It wouldn't save you from salmonella, but it might trick your tongue. You toss the meat into a pot with some lentils and turnips. If you boil it long enough, anything becomes edible, or at least chewy. The stew bubbles with a grim determination, filling the cottage with a smell that's less bad than before. Your grandmother adds a handful of herbs from the garden. Sage, thyme, and something you're 70% sure isn't poisonous. She calls it kitchen magic. You call it emergency camouflage? A fringe detail? In some medieval cookbooks, cooks are advised to hang meat until it stinks. Yes, on purpose. Some believed aging meat this way made it more tender. Others thought the smell meant it was properly seasoned. And in a strange twist of culinary philosophy, putrefaction wasn't always a red flag. You ladle the stew into a wooden bowl. It sloshes like mud. A few white threads float on top. Possibly onion, possibly not. You taste it. It's meaty, smoky, and a little sour. Your brain decides it's good enough, and your stomach stops complaining. Later, you'll gnaw on the bones and suck out the marrow. That's the richest part, if there's any left. You don't get meat often, so you make it count. Even the grease gets soaked up with stale bread and eaten. Waste nothing. A final bite reveals something chewy. Not meat, probably gristle, possibly tendon, hopefully not rat. As you wipe your mouth, you think back to the village feast last autumn. A pig was roasted on a spit, slathered in honey, and carved for everyone. That was the best meal of your life. You still dream about it. The smell, the crackling skin, the way it didn't fight your teeth. But that was a rare joy. Today, you eat what you can find, clean it as best you can, and boil it until the truth disappears. You glance at the pot. There's enough left for dinner, if nobody steals it first. Afternoon creeps in, and your stew-filled belly has done its best to settle. But meat alone won't carry you through the day, especially not that questionable lump you boiled into submission earlier. So now, you turn to the true medieval staple. Not bread, not soup. Something far more humble, and often far more horrifying. The vegetable patch. You step outside, squinting at the sun as it filters through the thatch eaves. The garden looks more like a battlefield than a farm. A few wilted leeks lean sideways. Cabbages, their leaves riddled with holes, glisten faintly with slug slime. Root vegetables hide underground like guilty secrets. Still, it's food, and you're going digging? The ground is cold and uneven. You use a stick to prod the soil until it gives way to a lumpy turnip. It's more root than vegetable, with a skin like bark. You knock some of the dirt off. There's always more inside, and toss it in your basket. You find 2 carrots. White, not orange, because the modern ones haven't been bred yet. They're thin, knobby, and twist like arthritic fingers. This is the medieval vegetable experience. Tough, bitter, and occasionally moving. Most produce has blemishes, wormholes, or rot spots. You cut around those. You always cut around those. And if something has too much movement, you feed it to the pigs. Vegetables aren't glamorous in this era. They're peasant food, boiled into oblivion until texture is a distant memory. You chop your harvest and dump it into another pot. Today's pottage, a thick, stewy blend that changes daily depending on what's available. It might include cabbage, onions, and wild greens. Yesterday's had nettles. The day before, a pigeon feather. You try not to remember. You flavor it with whatever herbs grow nearby. Parsley if you're lucky, dill if you're desperate. Spices, forget it. A pinch of pepper could buy a sheep. Cinnamon? That's for nobles and monks, not you. Still, your mother insists vegetables are good for you. She has no proof, of course. Vitamins haven't been invented yet. But the priest once said, leeks keep away illness. And vampires. That last part was probably a joke. Probably. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually liked vegetables or just ate them because they had to. Some scholars believe peasants consumed a relatively healthy diet of greens and grains, low in meat, high in fiber. Others argue that malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies were rampant, and that greens were more famine filler than fuel. Today's pottage bubbles quietly over a low flame. The firewood is damp, so the kitchen smells like wet socks. You stir the pot with a wooden spoon that's been used for everything from gruel to glue. Bits cling to the sides like barnacles. You taste it. It's earthy, sharp, not quite rancid, but flirting with it. You add a dash of vinegar made from sour wine. It doesn't help much, but it makes the color more interesting. A quirky little tidbit. Some medieval cooks believed vegetables had personalities. Onions were hot, cabbages cold, in the humoral theory that dominated medicine. You were supposed to balance these qualities in your meals. Feeling sluggish? Add some garlic. Too fiery? Cool down with lettuce. If only emotional stability worked the same way. Your neighbor shows up with a handful of mushrooms. You eye them suspiciously. Medieval mushroom identification is basically a death lottery. One wrong cap, and your dinner turns into a funeral. But she swears these are safe. She says her grandmother taught her. Then again, her grandmother also thought bathing caused disease. You toss a few in. If you're still standing tomorrow, you'll know they were fine. You ladle out a bowl for supper. It's thick, steamy, and smells like rain-soaked earth and boiled regret. You slurp it slowly, letting the warmth carry you through the bitter taste. You chew something stringy, possibly leek, possibly insect. You don't ask questions. You'll be hungry again in an hour. Evening settles in with a damp chill, curling in through the cracks in your cottage walls. The fire gutters low, casting shadows that stretch like long, tired fingers across the dirt floor. You sit by the hearth, bowl in hand, pondering a fundamental question of medieval cuisine. Why is everything so bland? Salt. You dream of it, not just for flavor, but for preservation, healing, and bargaining. It's the white gold of the Middle Ages, but it's also wildly expensive and tightly controlled. If you're lucky, you get a handful a month, mostly used to keep meat from turning into a biology experiment. You're not about to waste it seasoning turnips. You reach for your little pouch of flavorings, a tragic medley of dried onion, vinegar dregs, and maybe a few juniper berries if you're feeling fancy. You've heard tales, wild tales, of spices that set your tongue on fire. Cinnamon from the Far East, clove-studded oranges, saffron more expensive than gold. But those are fairy tales, passed down from merchants who passed down stories, from travelers who probably passed out from dysentery. Still, you do what you can. You crush some dried garlic with a rock and toss it into your pot. The scent rises, sharp, sour, oddly comforting. Garlic is your best friend. It goes with everything, scares off imaginary demons, and makes your breath so bad, no one wants to steal your food. You try a trick your cousin swears by, adding stale ale to your pottage. It gives it a malty bitterness, something that feels a little like depth, like an echo of flavor rather than the real thing. Here's a fun fact. Noble kitchens did use spices in abundance. They ground pepper, cardamom, nutmeg, and galangal into everything, sometimes just to show off wealth. The food may not have tasted great, but it reeked of exotic power. Royals and bishops consumed entire animals drenched in imported spice blends, their tongues dancing while yours napped. Historians still argue whether this spice obsession was about taste, status, or simply a misguided belief that spices could preserve food longer. Some say it masked decay. Others think it was just fashion, a medieval culinary arms race with cloves instead of cannons. You bite into your stew again, still bland, still warm. You've stopped expecting surprise. A little chew, a little mush, and a flavor profile somewhere between wet bark and dirt with ideas. That's the standard. You remember your trip to the monastery last year. The monks served lentils with mustard seeds and crushed herbs. It blew your mind. For days, you imagined what mustard seeds looked like. You've never seen them, just tasted their ghost. Now, you tend your own garden of flavor enhancers: marjoram, thyme, rosemary, if they haven't been trampled by goats. They're weeds with ambition, and when you boil them down, they give a hint of not nothing. You sip some ale, weak, sour, a little fizzy, but safer than water. The well water sometimes carries more than just rain. You'd rather taste old bread than risk dysentery again. The ale helps wash the blandness from your tongue. Barely. A fringe detail? In some medieval courts, spices were locked in chests and overseen by appointed pepperers who guarded the precious stockpile like it was royal treasure. One misplaced bag of saffron could spark serious accusations, or worse, a duel with ladles. You wrap a piece of stale rye bread in cloth to soften it overnight. Tomorrow, it'll soak up whatever's left in the pot. It's dense, sour, and dry, but it fills the corners of your belly. Outside, the night sounds take over. Distant hooves, dogs barking, a donkey braying as if to say, "You call that a meal?" And yet here you are, fed, sort of. Warm, almost. You dream of a pinch of cinnamon, just a pinch. But tonight, you'll settle for garlic breath and vague optimism. Morning mist rolls in like a soggy curtain, curling around your ankles as you trudge through the courtyard, clutching a bucket and a faint sense of purpose. It's dairy day, or as you privately call it, the weekly gamble with curdled fate. You make your way to the cow, a lopsided creature named Elspeth who always looks mildly offended. She eyes you with the weary suspicion of someone who knows her breakfast is late and her udder's about to be handled with cold hands. You mumble a morning apology and get to work. Milking isn't glamorous. The stool wobbles, your hands cramp, and Elspeth swats you with her tail more times than feels accidental. But eventually, you have your prize, a sloshing pail of fresh foamy milk. You hold it like it's treasure, because, in a way, it is. Now comes the real game: what to do with it before it turns. Refrigeration is a fantasy from the far, far future. So in the medieval world, milk has a tragically short window between fresh and science experiment. You get maybe a day, 2 if it's cold, and if no one breathes too hard near it. So you work fast. First, you set some aside to drink. It's warm, a little grassy, and honestly kind of weird. Medieval folks didn't guzzle milk like modern people do. It was often considered child food, or something only sick people drank. You sip it anyway, because calcium probably matters, even if no one's invented the word yet. The rest? Time to turn it into cheese, or something like cheese. You heat the milk gently over the hearth, stirring with a stick that's also been used to make soap, candles, and maybe a mysterious paste you'd rather not remember. When it's warm enough, you add rennet, a magical enzyme that comes from the stomach lining of a calf. Yum! If you don't have any, you toss in something sour like vinegar or wine, cross your fingers, and whisper to St. Bridget. Curds form. Globs, really. You scoop them out and press them into a cloth-lined mold. The whey drains off. Some of it gets fed to pigs, and some might become a very tragic soup tomorrow. And there it is, a pale, rubbery round of fresh cheese. It's not aged. It's not sharp. It tastes faintly of barn, but it's dense, nutritious, and surprisingly filling. You sprinkle it with salt, if you can spare it, and tuck it into a cool corner to firm up. It might last a week, or it might grow legs and walk off. Hard to say. Fun fact: medieval people didn't eat much aged cheese unless they were wealthy. Most cheese was soft, mild, and eaten quickly. The stinky, complex cheeses we romanticize today, those were rare delicacies or accidental science projects. But cheese was survival. It stored milk's goodness a little longer and gave peasants something to barter with. A few rounds could buy firewood or favor or passage into a slightly less miserable marriage. Historians still argue whether dairy was central to the peasant diet or just an occasional treat. Some records suggest widespread cheesemaking on manors. Others insist many families couldn't spare enough milk to make it worthwhile. What's clear is that when you had it, you used every drop. Later in the morning, you bring the leftover whey to your neighbor. She uses it in her bread dough to add protein. You trade for a heel of dark rye and a cup of buttermilk she's been nursing in a jug for 3 days. It's sharp. It's sour. It makes your cheeks twitch. But it's a change from water and stew, so you sip it gratefully. A quirky side note: some households use sour milk as a beauty treatment. Women dabbed it on their faces, believing it softened skin. You tried it once. It just made you smell like a goat for 3 hours. By noon, the cheese sits proudly on the shelf. It won't win awards, but it won't kill you either. You count that as a win. And as Elspeth snorts contentedly in her stall, you whisper your thanks and wonder, just for a moment, what camembert might taste like. The sun climbs higher, baking the thatched roofs until they steam faintly, like sleepy dragon scales. It's time for your least favorite chore: digging in the garden. Not because you dislike hard work, but because medieval soil is about as generous as an angry landlord. You kneel beside a crooked row of parsnips, hands already caked in yesterday's mud. Your garden is small, scratchy, and moody. It offers food like it's doing you a personal favor. The earth yields grudgingly, and only if you woo it with manure, ash, or whispered threats. But this is your lifeline. Your root vegetables, turnips, beets, carrots, onions, are the unsung heroes of your meals. They fill the pot and your belly, even if they all taste faintly like earth and tears. You pull up a beet, its red juice smearing your fingers like you've committed a minor crime. Vegetable gardening in the Middle Ages isn't just survival. It's a kind of diplomacy. You must negotiate with nature daily. Rain? Too much, and your crops rot. Too little, and they shrivel. Frost can show up uninvited and kill your entire winter plan. And pests? You've declared war on snails. You try to plant in cycles. Peas and beans enrich the soil. Cabbage grows year-round if the goats don't beat you to it. You've heard that leeks keep the devil out, though it might just be the smell. Still, you grow them. Can't hurt. A fun detail: in medieval England, the stew garden, or potager, was common. A little patch of whatever could stretch a stew. Think wild greens, herbs, and anything edible that didn't actively fight back. Nettles, sorrel, purslane. You learn quickly not to judge a weed by its sting. You wipe sweat from your brow and move on to the peas. They're drying up already. You mutter under your breath. Maybe the soil's gone sour again. You'll need to dig in some ashes from the hearth. Maybe even bribe the priest for a sprinkle of holy water, just in case. Historians still argue whether peasants truly starved, as often as records suggest, or if the chroniclers exaggerated to stir pity or reinforce social order. What's certain is that if your garden failed, your winter looked bleak. For the poorest folk, even gardening wasn't guaranteed. If you were a landless laborer, you relied on communal plots or scraps near your cottage. Any space could become a garden, window ledges, alley corners, graveyard edges. You learn to make do. Today's harvest isn't terrible. You've got a few onions, a squash, and some limp kale that insists on being bitter. Enough for a stew, especially if you bulk it with barley or oats. That's the trick. Vegetables stretch, but grains fill. You hear a neighbor complaining about their carrots, stunted again. You swap a handful of onion tops for some mustard greens. They've bolted, gone spicy and weird, but they'll add bite to the bland. You nod solemnly. Better than wood shavings, you say, and mean it. A fringe practice? Some villagers believe planting certain crops during specific moon phases improves yield. You've tried it. Once it worked. Once it didn't. The moon's fickle that way. You haul your basket inside, kicking dirt off your boots. Tonight's supper will be the usual mystery blend of things that taste vaguely nutritious. The colors, earthy browns, sullen greens, regretful purples, won't inspire joy, but they'll do the job. You clean the vegetables, trimming off rotten bugs. It's not gross anymore. It's just routine. You don't flinch when you find half a worm. You just flick it away and keep peeling. One last quirk. Medieval cookbooks, rare and mostly written by nobles, barely mention vegetables. They weren't glamorous. They were peasant food. Invisible, but essential. A bit like you. The stew simmers. You taste it. Needs something. You reach for salt. Remember you're almost out, and toss in some dried mint instead. It's interesting. As the sun dips and the shadows stretch across your garden again, you feel oddly proud. The soil didn't beat you today. You grew something. You'll eat. And tomorrow, you'll try again. The sun is dipped low, casting long shadows that slant through the cottage door like lazy blades. You stretch your back, cracking audibly, and glance toward the hearth. It's time to cook something real. Something hot, or at least something passable. You shuffle to the pot, hanging over the fire. It hasn't moved in days. This is not unusual. Welcome to the glory of perpetual stew. Yes, you heard that right. You don't cook a new stew every night. You just keep adding to the same one. A splash of broth here, a hunk of yesterday's bread there, maybe a shank bone someone tossed your way. It's like a community project, if the community is mostly root vegetables and old cabbage. Tonight, you stir the pot. A leathery scrap of mutton floats to the top. You poke it, unsure if it's still meat or if it's been slowly converting into broth by osmosis. You shrug. Into your bowl it goes. You add more water to replace what boiled off. Toss in a beet and crumble in some stale barley bread. A few dandelion greens from the roadside finish the masterpiece. You taste it. It's medieval. Now here's the thing. This isn't laziness. This is survival engineering. Firewood is precious. Time is tight. And cooking from scratch each day is a fantasy for people who own tapestries. So the stew lives on, bubbling gently, a living organism of taste and chance. This practice was so common, it earned a name, eternal pot. Some families kept theirs going for weeks, even months. Legends swirl of stews that lasted generations, with each spoonful containing centuries of heritage, and possibly the same piece of onion. Historians still argue whether this was truly a standard practice in every home or more common among urban poor and travelers. Some point to archaeological remains that show charred pots refilled repeatedly. Others argue we might be romanticizing what was, in reality, food fatigue. As you eat, you hear footsteps outside. A neighbor stops by. Old Mags, nose like a scythe, voice like vinegar. She's traded you a hunk of salted pork fat. You tear off a strip, dice it into the stew, and the flavor explodes like a medieval fireworks display. You almost weep. Pork fat is culinary gold. Salted, smoked, or fresh, it changes everything. It coats the tongue, feeds the belly, and makes even boiled weeds taste like indulgence. For peasants, it's the difference between tolerable and I might survive another winter. But fat is hard to come by. You don't slaughter animals often. Too costly. When you do, it's a community event, and every part is used. The fat is rendered, stored, or rubbed into cloth to make candles when it's too rancid for stew. Yes, you've eaten by pork fat light while eating pork fat soup. Efficiency is the name of the game. You share the stew with your cousin's youngest, who hasn't eaten since morning. He gulps it like it's stew from the king's own kitchen. He doesn't ask what's in it. That's a rule here. Don't ask. Another oddity? You've heard tales of people flavoring stew with burnt toast or scorched grains. Not for nutrition, but for a sort of smoky depth. It's the closest thing you've got to culinary technique. You tried it once, charred the bread just enough, crumbled it in. The stew tasted like wet chimney. Still, it felt fancy. You lean back, bowl in lap, and let your mind wander. You dream of spices, not pepper. You've had that once, but it costs more than your shoes. No, you dream of saffron, cinnamon, ginger, things that whisper of far-off lands and silk-wrapped traders. But you know better. The only spice you'll likely taste again is mustard seed or horseradish, both sharp enough to wake the dead and grow naturally in fields nearby. You nibble a pickle to cleanse your palate. A turnip brined weeks ago in a cracked pot behind the cottage. It crunches. That's something. A fringe note? Some peasants placed hot stones into stew pots to boil water when firewood ran short. You've tried it. It works, but the stones occasionally explode. Nothing like surprise shrapnel with your supper. You rinse your bowl in the same water you'll use for laundry tomorrow, saving the dregs for the pigs. You glance at the stew pot, still bubbling gently, and smile. It'll still be there in the morning, waiting to become whatever tomorrow demands. You bank the fire, wrap a shawl around your shoulders, and crawl into your straw-stuffed bed. Your belly isn't full, not really, but it's warm. And in a world where bread molds fast and meat is a rumor, that's a quiet triumph. You wake to the faint scent of wood smoke and something odd. Is that bread? Actual, honest bread? You bolt upright, ignoring the straw poking your back. That's not just wishful thinking. Someone's baking. You shuffle to the hearth and peek into your cupboard. 2 crusts and a heel, rock hard and gently fuzzed. You sigh. Still edible, technically. Bread in the Middle Ages is both a miracle and a menace. When it's good, it's glorious. When it's bad, well, let's just say there's a reason people softened it in soup. Today, you're determined to try baking, or at least begging someone else to. Flour is precious. Yours was milled a week ago at the Lord's windmill, and it cost you more than you like to admit, both in silver and humility. The miller always loses a little on the scale, and you're never allowed to check the weight yourself. He smiles too much for someone surrounded by sacks of grain. You dump the flour into a bowl. It's not pure white. Of course not. That's for nobles. Yours is brownish gray and studded with mystery particles, bits of husk, straw, and the occasional pebble. Sifting helps. So does lowering your standards. You mix it with yesterday's sourdough starter, kept alive in a ceramic jar by the fire. It smells tangy. Alive. Almost too alive. You knead it by hand, which feels less like baking, and more like wrestling a damp cat. Still, you press on. Here's your first joke of the day. Bread is life, and sometimes death. Medieval bread could be dangerous. Rye was especially tricky. If stored poorly, it could host claviceps purpurea, or ergot, a toxic fungus. Eat enough, and you hallucinate, convulse, or just drop dead. Some call it St. Anthony's fire. You call it Tuesday. Historians still argue whether widespread ergot poisoning led to outbreaks of mass hysteria, medieval witch hunts, or even inspired tales of dancing plagues. Whatever the truth, you double-check your rye loaf for purple spots and hope for the best. You leave the dough to rise. Though in winter, it might just sulk. Bread doesn't always behave. Some days, it rises triumphantly. Other times, it sits like a sad lump, judging you. You've yelled at your dough before. You'll do it again. While it rests, you prepare the oven. You don't have one, not really. A proper bread oven is a communal luxury. On baking day, the village women line up, dough in arms, gossip in mouths. The oven burns hot all morning, and by late afternoon, your turn arrives, if you bribe the baker with a turnip or a flattering word. Today, though, you use your fire pit. You clear the coals, place a heavy lid over your baking pot, and pray. The result won't be pretty, but with luck, it'll be crusty and edible. As you wait, you snack on trenchers. These aren't snacks so much as edible plates. Stale hunks of coarse bread that soak up stew or meat juices. When you're done eating the topping, you eat the tray. In noble households, they're discarded or given to the poor. In yours, they're the main course. Bread is a social marker. White bread, soft and fine, belongs to the elite. You've tasted it once. Fluffy, warm, and suspiciously bland. Your daily loaf, in contrast, could survive a catapult launch and still injure someone. But it's yours. A quirky fact. In some regions, people added bark, acorns, even ground up peas to bulk out flour. Not for flavor, just survival. Bread was rarely just wheat. It was whatever could be dried, ground, and vaguely resembled grain. You once bit into a crust and found a pebble. It won. You lost a tooth? The smell deepens. You lift the lid. Your loaf is respectable. Cracked on top, dense at the base, but baked through. You break off a piece and chew. It's chewy. It's hearty. It's yours. You share it with a neighbor's child who beams like you've handed her a jewel. For peasants, bread isn't just food. It's currency, gift, offering, and prayer. When you have bread, you have leverage. When you don't, well, let's not think about that. As dusk creeps in, you slice the rest for supper, laying it beside a bowl of onion broth. The bread soaks up the liquid greedily. You chew slowly, savoring the taste of effort. You glance at the crumb, dense and speckled, and smile. A quiet victory. You didn't burn it. It didn't kill you. And for one moment, you feel rich. The chill of early morning creeps in as you step outside, the faint fog curling around your feet like a curious cat. Your breath puffs in the cold air, mixing with the scent of damp earth and something faintly sour. Probably yesterday's stew fermenting just a little too eagerly. You wrap your threadbare cloak tighter and head toward the village well, bucket in hand. Water, the life giver, and also the great medieval gamble. You know that fetching water is never simple. The well might be your salvation or the source of your next stomach ache. Sometimes the water is crystal clear, fresh and cold enough to make your fingers sting. Other times, it's murky, teeming with microbes you'll never see, but will feel soon enough. You lower the bucket slowly, trying not to disturb the scummy surface. A few precious moments pass before the wooden rope creaks under the weight of water and you haul it up. The smell is earthy, but clean enough for drinking. You cup your hands and take a sip. It's not river water, thank goodness, but it still carries hints of algae and mud. Water in the Middle Ages was a puzzle. Running water? A luxury. Wells were common but not foolproof. Contamination from nearby latrines or animal pens was an ongoing problem. And even when water looked clear, it could harbor unseen dangers. You've heard that boiling water was a method to purify it, but fuel scarcity often made that a rare indulgence. Instead, many relied on settling, letting water stand for hours so impurities sank to the bottom. You've tried it, but patience isn't exactly a medieval virtue. A fringe practice? Some villagers added herbs like mint or thyme to water, hoping the scent would ward off sickness, or at least make the sip less gross. You chuckle at the memory of your uncle insisting that lavender water cured everything except death. Historians still argue whether medieval urban populations understood waterborne diseases as we do today. Some believe people connected bad water to illness, while others think it was random chance or divine punishment. As you fill your bucket, you notice a swarm of flies buzzing near the well's stone edge. They remind you that water attracts both life and death. Nearby, a dog licks from a puddle, unbothered by invisible dangers. Carrying the heavy bucket back home, you wonder how many liters it will take to cook your next meal, wash your face, and keep the few chickens alive. Water scarcity shapes every day. Later, you use some of the water to wash vegetables, grimacing as the mud clings stubbornly. You save the leftover water to rinse your hands one last time before nightfall. Medieval water isn't just a resource. It's a daily negotiation with survival, luck, and a touch of superstition. You sip again, savoring the cool freshness as the sun finally peaks above the horizon. It's a small victory in a world where every drop counts. The sun dips low again, and with it comes the delicate art of preserving what little food you have left. You don't just eat what's fresh. You stretch every crumb and drop to last through the biting cold and lean seasons ahead. Preserving food in medieval times is more than a convenience. It's a necessity carved by the hands of generations who know that winter can be a merciless thief. You watch as your mother, or perhaps you yourself, hang strips of salted meat by the rafters, its scent a blend of musk and hope. Salt is the medieval magic wand. It draws out moisture, stopping bacteria from partying too hard inside your food. But salt doesn't grow on trees. It's a precious mineral mined or traded over long distances, sometimes worth more than gold. You use it sparingly, saving the best cuts for it. Pickling is another trick in your toolbox. You fill earthenware jars with vegetables submerged in vinegar or brine. The tartness puckers your lips even as it wards off spoilage. These jars sit in dark corners of your home, glowing faintly with the promise of summer's harvest trapped inside glass or clay. A quirky bit. In some places, people preserved eggs by coating them in clay or burying them in ash. It sounds bizarre, but it worked well enough to give a poor peasant a surprise protein source months after the hens stopped laying. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the science behind preservation or simply followed passed down wisdom. Either way, it's clear that without these techniques, famine would have struck even harder. Drying is another favorite. You string herbs, fruits, and sometimes even fish near the fire, letting smoke and heat chase away moisture. Dried foods are light and easy to store, perfect for journeys or winter scarcity. You smile as you pull a piece of jerky from a bag, leathery and a little tough. Chewing it feels like gnawing on an old boot, but the flavor is rich and smoky. It's better than nothing. Preservation isn't just practical, it shapes taste and culture. Imagine a world where pickles are prized delicacies and salt rubbed meats are celebrations. It's not fancy, but it's food that survives. Later, you dip a crust of stale bread into a bowl of cold preserved cabbage. The sour bite makes your tongue tingle and reminds you that even in tough times, flavor finds a way. You glance at the pantry shelves, lined with glass jars and salted bundles. Each holds a story of harvest, labor, and survival, frozen in time and taste. As night falls, you tuck these preserved treasures away, knowing they might be the difference between hung you wake again, this time to the lively cacophony of the village market, the heartbeat of medieval life, where food smells mingle, hawkers shout, and the air vibrates with urgency. You push through the crowd, clutching a few coins tight in your hand, ready to barter for whatever scraps might keep you fed for another day. Markets are a chaotic symphony of sights, sounds, and smells. Fresh vegetables, if you're lucky, stacked in neat piles. Fish flapping on beds of ice, or sometimes just lying on wooden boards, glistening and a bit questionable. Spices brought in from faraway lands that promise to turn bland meals into something exotic and exciting, if only you can afford them. You hear the sharp cry of the poulterer selling chickens, their feathers flapping as customers haggle fiercely over prices. Meat is a luxury here, and you watch, knowing that even a tiny drumstick costs more than you earn in a week. But it's not all bleak. There are bread vendors with baskets spilling over with crusty loaves, cheese makers hawking their pungent wheels, and honey sellers with golden jars glinting in the sunlight like treasure. A curious tidbit: some markets had designated fish days because fresh fish was rare and highly prized inland. On those days, the air smelled like the sea, sharp, salty, and unmistakable. You once tried to sneak a herring home without paying, but the fishmonger caught you with a grin and a swift finger on your nose. Historians still argue how much the average peasant truly benefited from market economies versus being stuck in subsistence farming. Was the market a gateway to variety, or just a reminder of what was out of reach? You trade a few coins for a turnip, a handful of dried beans, and a small wheel of cheese that smells faintly of barnyard, but in a good way. Bartering skills matter here. Knowing when to push and when to smile can mean the difference between a full belly and empty hands. As you leave the market, you spot a traveling spice merchant. Exotic scents waft from his cart: cinnamon, cloves, and something you can't quite place. You dream briefly of far-off places where food tastes like celebration every day, unlike your usual stew of watery cabbage and tough meat. The market is also the place for news, gossip, and the occasional brawl. You sidestep a shouting match over a stolen loaf and continue your slow trek home. The day's purchases balance precariously in your arms. Tonight's meal feels a little brighter thanks to the market's chaotic generosity. It's still humble, but it's yours, earned with sweat, patience, and a little luck. You wonder how many more market days you'll see before the cold drives everyone. Was the market a gateway to variety, or just a reminder of what was out of reach? You trade a few coins for a turnip, a handful of dried beans, and a small wheel of cheese that smells faintly of barnyard, but in a good way. Bartering skills matter here. Knowing when to push and when to smile can mean the difference between a full belly and empty hands. As you leave the market, you spot a traveling spice merchant. Exotic scents waft from his cart: cinnamon, cloves, and something you can't quite place. You dream briefly of far-off places where food tastes like celebration every day, unlike your usual stew of watery cabbage and tough meat. The market is also the place for news, gossip, and the occasional brawl. You sidestep a shouting match over a stolen loaf and continue your slow trek home, the day's purchases balanced precariously in your arms. Tonight's meal feels a little brighter, thanks to the market's chaotic generosity. It's still humble, but it's yours, earned with sweat, patience, and a little luck. You wonder how many more market days you'll see before the cold drives everyone you blow gently on your spoon, savoring the warmth. Tomorrow, you'll try to add a bit more garlic, or maybe some wild garlic mustard if you can find it. Small victories. For now, you lean back, listening to the crackle of the fire, and let the flavors settle on your tongue. The night deepens, and the hard work of the day fades into memory. But your thoughts linger on the ritual of feasting, or rather, its elusive promise in medieval life. You've heard tales of grand banquets from bards and travelers, where nobles sit at tables heaped with roasted swans, peacocks, and spiced wine flowing like rivers. But for you? Well, feasts are rare bursts of light in a largely monotonous diet. You remember the village feast last harvest? A loud, smoky event filled with laughter, song, and more food than you'd seen in months. The rich brought venison and pies filled with sweetmeats, while the peasants got large pots of pottage, sometimes flavored with herbs, and whatever scraps the Lord deemed generous enough to share. Historians still argue whether medieval feasts were as extravagant, as romanticized, or more restrained behind closed doors. But one thing is clear: these events reinforce social hierarchies, making the divide between lord and serf all the more palpable. A quirky snippet for you: at some feasts, the table settings were so elaborate that certain dishes were served with gold or silver utensils, while the peasants ate from wooden bowls, their meals often a far cry from the spectacle on the high table. You wonder what it would be like to lift a golden goblet or bite into a spiced swan, but also how tiring the pomp must have been. Back in your humble home, feasts feel like distant dreams, yet they shape your understanding of food as more than survival. It's culture, power, and sometimes even rebellion. You also know that certain religious holidays called for fasting or abstaining from meat, which meant long stretches of eating little more than beans, bread, and fish. This makes you appreciate the few times you actually get a decent chunk of meat or a slice of cheese. Feasts were also opportunities for storytelling, dancing, and connection. You recall the minstrel's voice rising in the great hall, weaving tales that whisked listeners far from the cold stone walls. Tonight, you drift off with a stomach still a little empty, but a heart warmed by stories and the hope of better meals to come. The memory of that feast, with its fleeting joy and plenty, is a flicker of light in the long, dark winter. As dawn breaks once more, you find yourself reflecting on the slow, grinding reality of medieval food. The hunger, the scarcity, and the strange rituals wrapped around every meal. Your body aches in ways that modern comforts have erased, but you've learned to survive on what the land, the seasons, and sheer stubbornness provide. You remember the tangled relationship people had with their food, not just fuel, but a connection to faith, tradition, and the harsh rhythms of life. Food was scarce, yes, but it was also celebration, fear, hope, and sometimes rebellion. Today, you think about the last piece of stale bread, the thin slice of cheese, and the watery pottage that somehow sustained you. You've heard whispers that some lords had cooks skilled enough to prepare meals that dazzled the senses. It seems like another world, one you might glimpse only in dreams or in the songs sung by traveling bards. Historians still argue whether the medieval diet was more varied than commonly believed, or if the stereotype of dull, monotonous meals is mostly true. Maybe it depended on where you lived, your social rank, and how lucky you were with the harvest. A curious fact: in some regions, people drank beer or ale more than water, not just for taste, but because fermentation killed many harmful germs. You wonder what it must have been like to have a cold pint after a long day. Modern problems, right? As you prepare for bed, your thoughts drift to the future, imagining a time when food isn't a daily gamble, but a reliable comfort. For now, you close your eyes, feeling the rough blankets and the fading warmth of the hearth. The taste of yesterday's stew lingers faintly, a reminder of survival and endurance. You breathe out slowly, the weight of hunger momentarily softened by the quiet peace of night. The day's stories fade as you settle deeper into your blankets, the echoes of hunger and hardship giving way to calm. Remember, the past may have been tough, but you've journeyed through it with courage. Let the quiet warmth cradle you now. Sleep gently, knowing tomorrow brings another chance, another meal, and another story. End of script. Sweet dreams.